The Nicaraguan regime decided to retire from the Organization of American States following the institution's criticism and diplomatic actions against Managua, considering the sham elections that took place a couple of weeks ago. This way, we're talking about another episode of the dream situation that the Central American country has been experiencing over the last few years, in this case, ending with its long-term relationship with this organization. This way, we can say that Nicaragua is essentially following the same path of Venezuela. After all, we need to remember that the Maduro regime decided to essentially retire from the Organization of American States, essentially by the same reason, essentially by the way this organism, this institution was criticizing the socialist regime of dictator Nicolas Maduro, and even before with the dictatorship of former authoritarian president Hugo Chavez. Unfortunately, the most undeniable fact on this situation is essentially that none of this will affect Nicaraguan dictator Daniel Ortega. None of this will affect the Nicaraguan regime. None of this will mean that the Nicaraguan regime is essentially experiencing its last months in power. This doesn't mean that, because on these days, following the end of the Cold War, the different institutions that were created in the Cold War, and the Organizations of American States is one of these institutions. These institutions don't have the same power as before. The fact that these institutions decide to take different type of diplomatic actions against a regime that is violating certain international rules, none of this means that the end is near for these regimes. It doesn't mean that. So unfortunately, none of this will bring the highly expected and the highly anticipated regime change in Nicaragua. As a matter of fact, this will only make a pretty significant geopolitical change, because this situation will only increase the Nicaraguan regime's dependency on Cuba and especially Russia and China. We need to remember that in Latin America, the main supporter of the Nicaraguan regime has always been Cuba, Havana, and of course Venezuela. So this will increase the dependency of these both nations, but especially of Russia and China, because we need to remember that unlike the cases of Venezuela and the case of Cuba, Nicaragua is actually quite dependent on the commercial and the economic aspect with the US. And with all of this situation, the US could somehow change these types of relationships with Managua, demanding that Daniel Ortega follows the democratic path. So because of this will increase the dependency on Russia and especially China, because this commercial and economic dependency will now change to the Asian giant and of course to Moscow. So the next few months will be quite revealing, and we of course essentially portray the next situation, the next geopolitical table that will exist in this part of the world, not only in Central America but also Latin America. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.